Hello, I'm Dr Ingrid Mainland and I'm going to be providing you with an introduction to the University of the Highlands and Islands excavations at Skaill Farmstead. We've been excavating and undertaking archaeological field work at Skaill Farmstead in Rousay since 2015 as part of the UHI Landscapes of Change Archaeology of the Rousay Clearances and Westness Estate project. In this short presentation, I'm going to be providing you with an introduction to our work at Skaill Farm, as well as our project team, before going on to explain the rationale for the project and introducing some of the key themes we're addressing. Other lectures in this series will outline in more detail the historical background to Skaill. This is by Sarah Jane Gibbon, the archaeological evidence we've revealed so far by Dan Lee, and what this can all tell us about fishing practices and exploitation of the sea in the past. And this is a lecture by Jen Harland. I hope that you will enjoy these series of lectures that we've put together, and perhaps in the future, when we come back to excavate next year, you'll come along and have a look at the work that we're doing. So let me now introduce you to the project team. The project team is led by me and Dan Lee in collaboration with Jen Harland and Sarah Jane Gibbon. All of us are based at the UHI Archaeology Institute in Orkney College, and we all bring different areas of specialist expertise to the project. Sarah Jane, Jen and me all have an interest in Viking to post-medieval Scotland and the North Atlantic. Dan specialises in contemporary archaeology and post-medieval landscapes. I study past farming practices and dietary traditions. Jen specialises in marine exploitation in the past, and Sarah Jane in the archaeology of early medieval churches and castles. During the excavation season, our regular site supervisors are Bobby Friel and Chris G, both of whom work for Orca, the commercial archaeology unit associated with the UHI Archaeology Institute. Bobby and Chris bring a wealth of experience in the archaeology of the North Atlantic Islands, and in addition, Bobby has great expertise in remote survey and digital imaging. Engagement with the Rousay community is a very important part of our project, and three Rousay folks, Chrissy, Anthony and Ewan, are integral members of our field team and have been joining us on site every year since the start of the project. More recently, Clea and Richard have joined our team as well. Bobby, of course, also hails from Rousay, and indeed both Sarah Jane and I have Rousay connections. So it's an all-round Rousay team. Skills development and the training of students and volunteers through a community archaeology approach underpins all the work that we do at Skaill. To this end, we've been joined by many other volunteers from Rousay through the years, as well as by students from the UHI and other institutions in the UK and beyond. And here are just some of the volunteers from Rousay who have been helping with our fieldwork during the course of the project, as well as some of the students who have helped out on site as well. Our project is also collaborating with other research groups, most notably with Historic Environment Scotland, who have undertaken a standing building survey of Skaill, as well as other 19th century crofts in Quandle, and also with the German Archaeological Institute, the RGK, who are currently undertaking extensive geophysical survey across Rousay. And of course, we're also working alongside Bradford University's excavations at Swandrow, complementing their work on Rousay's prehistoric occupants by providing new understandings of the history of Rousay from 800 AD onwards. So what is the background to our investigations, and why have we chosen to work at Skaill? Our project has several overarching themes, which we're trying to address through different aspects of our work, and which have framed the questions that we're asking of the site. I've outlined these on this overhead here, and I'll be now going into each of these aspects in a little bit more detail. So, turning first to community archaeology and impact. As I mentioned already, one of the primary motivations for our research is to work with the local community in Rousay to develop a better understanding of the archaeology and history of the island and its inhabitants. This develops from the wider work that the UHI does in the area of public and community outreach and heritage. Why are we interested in community archaeology? Well, we don't just want to come into the island, do our work and leave. It's your island, your heritage. Through our project, we want to work with your community to provide training in archaeology that will help people living in the islands to better understand its history and to provide you with the skills to engage with this past through excavation, survey, post-excavation and, most recently, archive work. Whether you're just interested in finding out more about the island's past, or whether you want this information to help with tourism-related activities, whether you're interested in doing some digging or in picking up a specific skill, such as planning, geophysics, standing building, survey, and so on. All of these things we're interested in working with you. But it's more than just an interest in the past. We're also working on the island and with the community through the Development Trust with a specific aim of stimulating tourism and economic development for Rousay in the present and in the future. Each year we add to the local economy through our presence on the island during fieldwork, by attracting visitors to the site to see us working, to attend our open days, and to the other activities that we run both during the field season and throughout the year. Just to give you some numbers, usually each 3-week field season, there'll be 10 to 15 of us staying within the island using the shop and the pub, and more travelling daily on the boat. Generally, we see around about 20 to 30 people coming by us each day to see us digging every day. And then during the open days that we run each year on site, we would expect to have around about 50 to 70 visitors, all of these people coming over on the boat. And then the Skaill Day that we ran in October 2019, we attracted 25 participants, most of whom actually came from across. So again, coming over on the boat and using the boat. In addition, our findings attract media interest. The Viking Hall, which you'll find out more about later on in the lecture and in Dan's talk, featured really very prominently in publications last year, in 2019. We attracted an awful lot of media attention, including CNN, and all of this attracts interest to Rousay and to Orkney as a place to visit, a place to come in and actually visit the archaeology. So again, stimulating tourism and economic development. A further theme that frames our research endeavours is that of coastal erosion. And to explain this, I'm going to give you some background to coastal erosion and the challenge it poses for Scotland's heritage. As I'm sure you all know, coastal erosion is quite simply the wearing away of the land and beach sediments by wave and tide action. This will include archaeological evidence, reflecting destruction of the material remains of coastal sediments within the coastal zone. Although this is an ongoing process, rates of coastal erosion are predicted to increase over the next century as a consequence of a global sea level linked to climate change. For the Scottish Islands, this is thought to be in the region of 0.4 to 0.5 metres, but increasing storminess, wave heights and surges will likely increase the impact. This has implications for modern coastal communities, but also for the archaeological and environmental evidence relating to past coastal communities and their ecosystems. The threat to Scotland's heritage by coastal erosion is well documented, and initiatives such as Skaill, supported by Historic Environment Scotland, have led to an understanding both of the scale of the problem and the identification of priority sites for excavation in advance of destruction. In Orkney alone, Skaill have identified nearly 80 sites under threat from coastal erosion, and it should be remembered that this is based on a sample of Orkney's coastline, so the actual total is much higher. It's not just structural evidence, and the iconic sites such as Skaill that are at risk. Eroding middens, peats and coastal lagoons are also being affected. Why are these of relevance? These provide data on past environments, on past farming and fishing practices, and on dietary choices in the past. All sources of information which can show us how people in the past adapted to the climate and to often quite substantial periods of climatic change. As a research team, we're particularly interested in middens that span the 13th to 18th centuries AD, a period which encompasses the Little Ice Age, when climate saw a dramatic downturn and life in the North Atlantic islands and northern Europe got very difficult. This was the time of ice fairs on the Thames. Imagine how miserable it was up here in Orkney at that time. Other major cultural changes occur at this time as well. You find a shift from Norse rule to Scottish rule, a development of urban markets across Europe, and increasing globalisation of trade. Also, this is the period of the Black Death. All these factors will have affected Orkney's sustainability and resilience to climate change. This allows us then to ask interesting questions about the adaptability of humans to climate change under different cultural constraints and in different contexts. More importantly, however, by working with local communities, we can also raise awareness of how climate change is affecting coastlines today and the impacts of climate change globally. So in other words, we can use this kind of research as part of our contribution to action for climate change. And I've got a couple of slides here to show you some of the sort of ways we're doing this. So one of the things that we've been doing over the time we've been working at Skaill is run a series of different workshops, primarily aimed, I would say, at younger people and at school children, but most, everyone has been welcome to attend. And these have been looking at different sources of evidence for past environments and for environmental change. Looking, for example, at the records of pollen that are preserved within lake sediments, loch sediments and peat sediments. They tell us that at one point there were many more trees in Rousay than we find today, and that as you move into the Neolithic and later prehistory up until the Viking and Norse time, we see a substantial reduction in the numbers of birch and other scrub woodland that we see in the islands. We've also taken school children around the coast at Westness, and also led groups around the coast at Westness to illustrate how much the coast has come in during the last 1,000 to 2,000 years. So in other words, showing coastal erosion in action and the implications of it for settlements around the coast. So why are we actually digging at Skaill? And this is a question that we sometimes get asked. Well, when we first started thinking about a project in Rousay, what we were wanting to do was link community archaeology with coastal erosion and with medieval middens, because it tells us all these really interesting things about resource use in the past. We started trying to find some sites that might be suitable for this. We looked first of all at the site of Broch, which is just along the coast from Skaill. And we could see that there were some middens eroding out of the cliffs, and this is a picture here of some of those middens. This is the middens eroding out here. The farmstead of Broch is just to the left here, up from the coast. If you look to the top of the screen here, you can just about make out the Westside kirk, and behind that Skaill's farmstead, where we are actually digging now. We did some pilot work on these middens just to see what they would be like in terms of contents, and we discovered that they are likely to be 18th or 19th century, and that they are full of limpets, they're full of fish bones. They've got some artifacts in them, and they would make a really good study. However, we felt that they weren't really very suitable for doing community work on, or indeed for working with students and other volunteers on, because they're situated right next to the cliff and would be a little bit dangerous. So we had a look around the coastline just to see what might be present at Skaill. Dan and a former colleague here went and did a little bit of digging around the site, a little bit of test pitting and some geophysical work, which Dan will tell you more about in his lecture, and found some very nice middens just in front of the standing ruin. So in other words, what we assume is the 19th century farmstead. And this then became the focus for our excavations, because they are indeed very rich middens. And I'll tell you a little bit more about these in subsequent slides. So here we are looking at Skaill. The right-hand slide shows the 19th century croft house. The left-hand slide shows Skaill in its wider context. This is where we were looking in the previous slide, the Roding Middens at Broch. This is the Westside Kirk, and there's the 19th century farmstead and the yard in front of it. Although Skaill's not severely affected by coastal erosion, it is in a vulnerable position, and I think the sort of overview slide shows this. Skaill lies behind a large boulder beach, which is clearly encroaching on the land. It's coming very, very close to the yard at Skaill, and it's done so in living memory. And it's likely to, with further storms, it may well come even further up. This, coupled with the fact that we're expecting rising sea levels in the next 50 to 100 years, places this site under threat of loss for the archaeological heritage and all the archaeological layers and the information within this that tells us all about our past lives in Rousay. So, our project wants to try and recover some of this information before it goes. A further research theme, perhaps not unsurprisingly given the nature of the site we're working on, is the archaeology of medieval and post-medieval Rousay. Today, Skaill seems very isolated, a charming ruin on the edge of Rousay. Yet, if we were to have visited Skaill 100 years ago, we would have found a very different place, the heart of a thriving community. Skaill and nearby Broch were the larger farms in a settlement of 10 to 15 crofts, spread over what is now the home fields of Westness farm. In 1840, the farmers in these crofts were removed from their homes as part of the Westness clearances to improve the trail estate, farm of Westness. Skaill was one of the last crofts to be cleared as a working farm in the 1850s, and was then used for farm servants at Westness until the last occupant, Barbara Smith, left in the 1880s. Excavation at Skaill allows us to explore in detail the lifestyle of these 18th to 19th century farming communities, their diets, farming and fishing practices and material culture, what their houses, byres and barns looked like, what kinds of tableware and cooking utensils they used, evidence for imported goods such as wines or beers, what their superstitions and rituals were. The 17th to 19th century in Scotland was a period of great change. There was a rise in urbanisation, there was a globalisation of trade, there was what is often referred to as the Scottish Agricultural Revolution, which introduced new ways of farming. For example, run-rig farming, as represented by many small fields, were replaced with large squared-off fields, as you see now in the farms of Westness. There was land closure, larger breeds of cattle and sheep were introduced, replacing the primitive breeds which had persisted in Orkney for thousands of years. You also found at this time an importation of refined flours, bread flour, which replaced traditional bare barley and oats. You get a wider use of cane sugar, historical evidence for the introduction of tea and coffee and the material culture associated with this, such as tea services, sugar bowls, and so on. Historical records are usually more concerned with the activities of merchants and larger landowners, can only hint at these introductions. The archaeological evidence from Skaill can show us when, or indeed whether, these food customs and farming practices of Rousay folk changed, and allow us to think about what impact this might have had on health, but also on the wider landscape and the wider community. Research is still ongoing, but we already have some insight into 18th to 19th century diet in Rousay. We find very little meat represented, mostly fish, which Jen will talk more about. The plant remains have not yet been studied, but we can assume from historical sources this would be another major component of the diet, bare barley and oats, for example. The animal bone evidence is already starting to provide some hints about stock. We can see both larger and small sheep in the upper 19th century levels, suggesting that Cheviot-type sheep were present in the islands at this time, but the traditional sheep still persisted, likely on the crofts. And as you can see at the bottom of the slide, we also find evidence for lovely 19th century china, indicating tea services and the drinking of tea, as you can find suggested in the historical records. We're also interested in what came before the crofting community in the west side of Rousay. Although crofts in the 19th century, Skaill and nearby Broch were once the residence of Orkney's elite. The Orkney saga, the saga of the Earls of Orkney, notes that in the 12th century, one of the Earls' chieftain, or Goething, had an estate at Westness in Rousay. It records that Earl Paul was visiting Westness for a feast when he was kidnapped by Svein Aslefsson from Egilsay. The precise location of Sigurd's Hall is unknown, but various authors have suggested it was located at Skaill. The place name Skaill derives from Skaill, or hall, and by the 13th century, Skaill was the site of a castle-type structure, the Wirk, which indicates an elite residence. It suggested that Sigurd's estate, or manor, comprised the land around Skaill and Broch, as well as inner Westness and potentially Quandle, i.e. very similar in size to Westness Farm today. Historical accounts during the 15th to 16th century also point to Skaill and Broch, which by this time have become separate properties, as being the residences of important people. During this period, Broch was owned by the Craigies, a Scottish family who'd married into the Orkney aristocracy during the 14th century and held positions of lawmen of Orkney. So in other words, they were among the leading families in Orkney at that time. In 2019, much to our excitement, we discovered walling and floors of a form consistent with a 10th to 12th century Viking hall. And although this has to be confirmed by C14 dates, finds of stay-type bowls suggest that we are broadly in the right period. So on these slides here, this is our Viking hall, which is located just off the slide here. Our excavations at the other side of the building, of the 19th century croft building, show a further set of substantial buildings. So this is the 19th century croft, and these are further structures underlying it, which we think date potentially from the 16th to 18th century. These are all associated with middens, so both the Norse Hall and the 16th to 18th century buildings are associated with middens containing residues of animal bones, pottery, glass, and other types of material culture, whetstones, buttons, coins, and so on. So in other words, for this site, we've got the whole sequence, the whole chronological sequence running from the 10th century all the way up to the end of the settlement in the 19th century, when Barbara Smith was cleared from the standing croft house. Tracing the trajectory of this farm and the estate from its heyday as the likely estate residence and feasting hall of one of the chieftains of the Earls of Orkney to the croft house of a landless servant is one of our research priorities for the future, and this is what our research will be concentrating on in the forthcoming years. So I hope you have enjoyed this introduction to the background to our excavations at Skaill, and I urge you now to have a look at Dan, Sarah Jane and Jen's talks, who will fill you in much more detail about our actual findings.